The flickering blue glow from the television cast dancing shadows across the empty living room. On the screen, a weatherman gestured at a map of Illinois, predicting clear skies for the weekend ahead. The volume was set to 14, just loud enough to hear from the kitchen, where a pot of coffee sat half full on the counter, still faintly warm. The front door was unlocked. In the driveway, both cars remained parked side by side, keys hanging on their hooks in the hallway. But the Anderson family, Robert, 42, his wife Diana, 39, and their two daughters, 15-year-old Lily and 12-year-old Grace, were gone. It was a Thursday morning in late September when Robert's brother James arrived at the modest two-story home in Rockford, Illinois. He'd driven over unannounced, planning to return a borrowed drill. When no one answered his repeated knocking, James tried the door and found it open. The house was eerily still, yet everything appeared normal. Dishes in the sink, Grace's backpack on the stairs, a half-completed jigsaw puzzle on the dining table. James called out, walking from room to room, but only silence answered. Within 20 minutes, he dialed 911. The first responders treated the scene with immediate seriousness. Detective Rita Vasquez, a veteran of the Rockford Police Department with 17 years on the force, arrived within the hour. She'd handled dozens of missing persons cases, but something about this one felt different from the start. The family hadn't packed suitcases. Their wallets and phones were missing, but Diana's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her reading glasses folded neatly beside it. Robert's work boots stood by the back door, though his everyday sneakers were gone. "Did your brother mention any travel plans?" Vasquez asked James in the front yard, her notepad already filling with observations. James shook his head, his face pale. Robert had texted him just 2 nights before about getting together for a Bears game this weekend. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Diana had posted a photo on social media the previous afternoon, a sunset view from their backyard with the caption, "Grateful for quiet moments." Nothing suggested they were planning to leave. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're from. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now, let's get back to the investigation. The police canvassed the neighborhood throughout the afternoon, knocking on doors along the tree-lined street where the Andersons had lived for 8 years. Their neighbors described them as a typical family. Robert worked as a logistics coordinator for a manufacturing company. Diana taught 2nd grade at Lincoln Elementary, and the girls were good students involved in school activities. Nobody reported hearing anything unusual the night before. No arguments, no strangers lurking around, no cars speeding away in the darkness. But as Detective Vasquez dug deeper, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Lily, the older daughter, had missed school that Wednesday without calling in sick. The attendance office had left a voicemail on the home phone that morning, still blinking red on the answering machine. Grace's math teacher mentioned she'd seemed distracted in class on Tuesday, repeatedly checking the clock. When pressed, the teacher recalled Grace asking if she could call her mother, but then changing her mind and saying everything was fine. By Friday, the case had drawn local media attention. The Rockford Register-Star ran a front-page story with the family's most recent photo, taken at Grace's 6th grade graduation just 4 months earlier. They looked happy, ordinary, completely unremarkable. Robert's arm was around Diana's shoulders, both girls smiling in matching blue dresses. The photo was reproduced on flyers that volunteers plastered across town, taped to storefront windows and utility poles. Robert's employer confirmed he'd worked his full shift on Wednesday, leaving the warehouse at 5:15 as usual. His supervisor noted nothing unusual about his demeanor. Diana had been at school until 3:30, attending a staff meeting about the upcoming parent-teacher conferences. She'd chatted with colleagues about a new curriculum and made plans to bring cookies to the faculty lounge the following Monday. Both parents had gone through their Wednesday routines with no apparent deviation. The forensic team spent 2 full days processing the house. They dusted for fingerprints, collected trace evidence, and examined every room with meticulous care. Nothing appeared disturbed. In the master bedroom, the bed was unmade on both sides, suggesting both Robert and Diana had slept there the night before. Diana's jewelry box remained on the dresser, containing several valuable pieces, including her grandmother's pearl necklace. Robert's wallet was missing, but his checkbook was still in the desk drawer with no unusual transactions. The most perplexing discovery came from the girls' rooms. Lily's bedroom showed signs of hasty packing, dresser drawers slightly open, empty hangers in the closet. But Grace's room looked untouched. Her stuffed animals arranged on the bed, homework spread across her desk, soccer cleats by the door. It was as if one daughter had known something the other hadn't, or perhaps one had been given time to prepare while the other had not. Detective Vasquez obtained records for all 4 family members' cell phones. The data revealed that all 4 devices had been active until approximately 11:40 p.m. on Wednesday night. Then simultaneously, they all went dark. No calls, no texts, no data usage. The last ping from the phones triangulated to a cell tower 6 miles west of their home, along Route 20, heading toward Freeport. After that, nothing, as if all 4 phones had been turned off or destroyed at exactly the same moment. The financial records told an equally puzzling story. Robert had withdrawn $400 from an ATM near his workplace on Wednesday afternoon at 4:30. It wasn't an unusual amount. He often kept cash on hand for household expenses, but Diana had also withdrawn $300 from a different bank branch during her lunch break that same day. Neither of them typically carried that much cash. When investigators checked their joint account, they found no other suspicious activity, no large withdrawals in the weeks prior, no evidence of financial distress. James provided police with access to Robert's email and social media accounts. For weeks, investigators combed through messages, searching for any clue. Robert's correspondence was mundane: work emails about shipment schedules, messages to James about family gatherings, a thread with an old college friend about possibly attending their upcoming reunion. There were no threatening messages, no signs of blackmail, no indication that Robert was involved in anything illegal or dangerous. Diana's classroom assistant mentioned that Diana had received a phone call during lunch on Tuesday that left her visibly upset. When asked about it, Diana had waved it off, saying it was just a family matter, nothing serious. The assistant didn't press further, and Diana had seemed fine by the afternoon. Investigators tried to trace the call, but Diana's phone records showed it came from a disposable prepaid number that had been disconnected shortly after. As autumn deepened and October arrived, the investigation expanded beyond Rockford. Law enforcement agencies across Illinois and neighboring states received bulletins with the family's photos and descriptions. The FBI's National Crime Information Center added their names to its missing persons database. Tips flooded in from across the region, reported sightings at gas stations, rest stops, and small-town diners. Every lead was investigated, and every lead resulted in nothing but dead ends and mistaken identities. The media coverage intensified. Local news stations ran nightly updates, and the story eventually caught the attention of national outlets. A CNN segment featured Detective Vasquez standing in front of the Anderson home, now wrapped in yellow police tape, describing the bewildering lack of evidence. This family didn't just disappear, Vasquez told reporters. They left behind their entire life, jobs, friends, a community that cared about them. Something caused them to walk away from everything, and we need to understand what that was. Robert's co-workers organized search parties that swept through nearby forests and parks. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the autumn leaves, calling out names, looking for any sign, a piece of clothing, a dropped wallet, anything that might provide a clue. Divers searched the Rock River. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the countryside. K-9 units followed scent trails that inevitably faded into nothing. Despite hundreds of hours and thousands of volunteer hours, the searches yielded nothing. Diana's mother, Elizabeth, flew in from Arizona and took up residence in a local hotel room that quickly became an unofficial command center for the family's search efforts. She gave tearful interviews, pleading for information, offering rewards, begging whoever had her daughter and granddaughters to let them go. Elizabeth described Diana as a devoted mother who would never voluntarily leave her daughters, much less take them into danger. The grandmother's anguish was palpable, her disbelief evident in every word. The community rallied around the case with remarkable determination. Local businesses donated funds for the reward money, which eventually climbed to $50,000 for information leading to the family's safe return. Churches held prayer vigils. Diana's school dedicated a memorial garden with 4 empty chairs, one for each missing family member. Lily and Grace's classmates wore blue ribbons, the family's favorite color, and refused to let their friends be forgotten. Yet as weeks turned into months, the harsh reality of missing persons investigations began to set in. Without evidence of foul play, without ransom demands, without bodies, the case existed in a terrible limbo. Detective Vasquez worked the case doggedly, following up on even the most unlikely tips, but the leads grew fewer and less promising. The news cameras eventually moved on to other stories. The volunteer searches became less frequent. Life, as it inevitably does, continued for everyone except the Andersons. The house remained preserved as a potential crime scene for 6 weeks before being released back to the family. James, as Robert's only sibling and closest relative, became the reluctant custodian of his brother's life. Walking through those rooms, seeing Diana's coffee cup still on the counter, Grace's backpack still on the stairs, Lily's homework still on her desk, it was unbearable. He couldn't bring himself to change anything, as if maintaining the scene might somehow bring them back. By late November, a criminal profiler from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the case file. Her assessment offered several possibilities, none of them comforting. The coordinated nature of the disappearance, the simultaneous phone shutoffs, the cash withdrawals, the apparent knowledge by at least one family member that they were leaving, suggested this wasn't a random abduction. Someone had planned this, and the family had either participated willingly or been coerced into cooperation. But who and why remained maddeningly unclear. Detective Vasquez developed a theory that someone from the family's past had resurfaced with information or threats that prompted them to flee. She dug into Robert and Diana's histories, interviewing old friends, former neighbors, anyone who might remember something relevant. Robert had grown up in Rockford, a relatively unremarkable childhood in a working-class family. Diana was originally from Tucson, moving to Illinois for college, where she'd met Robert. Neither had criminal records, no restraining orders, no history of domestic violence. They were, by all accounts, exactly what they appeared to be, a normal, happy family. Then, in early December, a break finally came. A state trooper in Iowa pulled over a vehicle for a broken taillight near Des Moines. During the routine traffic stop, the driver, a woman in her mid-30s, showed signs of extreme nervousness. When asked for her license and registration, she fumbled with the glove compartment, her hands visibly shaking. The trooper, trained to recognize suspicious behavior, asked if everything was all right. The woman insisted it was, but her eyes kept darting to the trunk. The trooper called for backup and requested permission to search the vehicle. The woman refused initially, then suddenly broke down in tears. She admitted there was something in the trunk the police needed to see. When the trooper opened it, he found documents, dozens of them. Fake identification papers, social security cards with the Andersons' names, but different numbers, bank statements for accounts registered under aliases. There were also photographs, surveillance images of the Anderson house taken from various angles over a period of weeks. The woman, who identified herself as Linda Brennan, was taken into custody and questioned extensively. Her story, when it finally emerged, was both tragic and infuriating. Linda was a private investigator from Chicago who'd been hired 6 months earlier by a client she would only identify as JC. Her job was to conduct surveillance on the Anderson family, document their daily routines, and identify vulnerabilities in their security. She claimed she had no idea what her client planned to do with the information. She was just doing a job. Linda's arrest provided the first real break in the case, but it also opened more questions than it answered. Who was JC, and why had they targeted the Andersons? Linda claimed all communication with her client had been through encrypted email and burner phones. Payment came in the form of cryptocurrency deposits. She'd never met JC in person, never heard their voice, had no idea if the initials were even real. The FBI's cybercrimes unit worked to trace the digital trail, but whoever JC was, they'd covered their tracks with professional precision. Detective Vasquez flew to Des Moines to interview Linda personally. In a cramped interrogation room, she pressed the private investigator for every detail, no matter how insignificant. Linda described watching the Anderson family for months, learning their patterns, noting when they came and went. She documented that Robert usually forgot to lock the back door when he took out the trash. She'd noted that Diana often left her purse visible through the kitchen window. She'd recorded the girls' walking routes to school, identifying 3 points where they were completely alone. The surveillance photos revealed something chilling. In several images taken during the last week before the family disappeared, there was another person, a man in a dark jacket who appeared repeatedly near the Anderson property. He was always at a distance, partially obscured, never facing the camera directly. Linda claimed she didn't know who he was. She assumed he was part of the neighborhood, but his presence in so many photos, always watching, always waiting, suggested otherwise. The FBI's facial recognition technology couldn't get a clear match, but they circulated the images to law enforcement nationwide. Armed with Linda's information, investigators took another look at the evidence from the Anderson home. This time, they knew what to look for. In Robert's home office, forensic accountants discovered something that had been missed before. Hidden in a folder labeled Tax Documents 2019, there was a letter printed on plain paper with no return address. The letter was dated 8 years earlier, shortly after the Andersons moved to Rockford. It was brief and cryptic. You can't hide from what you did. You can run, but eventually everyone pays. The letter had no signature, no specific threats, nothing that would have prompted police involvement at the time. Robert had apparently never reported it, never mentioned it to anyone. But someone had kept it, tucked away in a file, perhaps as a reminder of some past event that Robert and Diana had hoped to leave behind. The paper was tested for fingerprints and DNA, but 8 years of handling and storage had degraded any useful trace evidence. Still, the letter's existence confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The Andersons were running from something. Elizabeth, Diana's mother, was shown the letter. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. Her face went pale, and she sat down heavily in her chair. After a long silence, she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. There was something Diana had told her years ago, shortly after Lily was born. Diana and Robert had been living in Springfield then, working ordinary jobs, living an ordinary life. But Diana had confided in her mother that Robert had witnessed something at his workplace, something that put him in the middle of a criminal investigation. Robert had been working as a night manager at a warehouse that handled shipping logistics. One evening, he'd arrived for his shift early and stumbled upon his supervisor and 2 other men loading unmarked crates onto a truck. The transaction looked wrong. There were no manifests, no documentation, nothing in the computer system. Robert confronted his supervisor, who brushed it off as a last-minute order that would be logged in the morning. But Robert's instincts told him otherwise, and he reported what he'd seen to the company's owners. The investigation that followed revealed a sophisticated cargo theft operation. Robert's supervisor and several accomplices had been stealing high-value shipments for months, replacing them with worthless items and selling the genuine products through underground markets. Robert's testimony was crucial to the case. 3 men were arrested, prosecuted, and sent to federal prison for terms ranging from 5 to 15 years. Robert and Diana were assured they'd be safe, that the criminals had no reason to target them. But Diana had told her mother she never quite believed that. Robert had nightmares for months afterward. Elizabeth explained that shortly after the trial concluded, Robert and Diana decided to move. They left Springfield quietly, didn't tell many people where they were going, and eventually settled in Rockford under the pretense of finding better job opportunities. They changed their phone numbers, limited their social media presence, and started over. The letter, if it was connected to that old case, suggested someone had found them anyway. Someone had been waiting, watching, biding their time for the right moment to make good on an old grudge. Detective Vasquez immediately contacted federal authorities about the warehouse case. Records showed that the ringleader, a man named Vincent Calibrazi, had been released from federal prison 14 months before the Andersons disappeared. Calibrazi had served his full sentence, refusing parole opportunities because accepting parole would have meant admitting guilt and submitting to supervision. He walked out a free man with no restrictions, no monitoring, and, according to interviews with corrections officials, a barely concealed rage about the decade he'd lost. Vincent Calibrazi became the FBI's primary suspect. Agents descended on his last known address in Chicago, only to find he'd moved out 3 weeks after his release, with no forwarding information. His parole officer... he didn't have one because he'd served his full term. His former cellmate reported that Calibrazi talked obsessively about settling accounts once he got out. Phone records showed Calibrazi had made hundreds of calls in the months following his release, many to disposable phones that suggested he was deliberately covering his tracks. A nationwide manhunt for Calibrazi began in earnest. His photo was circulated to every law enforcement agency in the country. The FBI offered a reward for information about his whereabouts. Tips came in sporadically. He'd been seen in St. Louis, in Nashville, in Omaha, but each time agents arrived to investigate, Calibrazi was long gone. He was moving frequently, using cash, avoiding cameras, exhibiting all the behavior of someone who knew he was being hunted. Meanwhile, the search for the Anderson family continued with renewed urgency. If Calibrazi had them, they were in grave danger. But investigators also had to consider the possibility that Robert, knowing Calibrazi was out of prison and potentially seeking revenge, had moved his family into hiding preemptively. The simultaneous phone shutoffs, the cash withdrawals, Lily's apparent knowledge that they were leaving, it all suggested a planned disappearance rather than a violent abduction. Perhaps Robert had made a terrible choice, believing he was protecting his family by taking them underground. In January, 4 months after the disappearance, Diana's credit card was used at a gas station in Montana. The transaction was for $43, paid at the pump, no camera footage of the person who used it. By the time police were alerted and responded, whoever had used the card was long gone. The gas station was in a remote area between Billings and Miles City, surrounded by vast stretches of empty highway. It was impossible to know which direction they'd gone. But it was proof. Someone in the family was alive, or at least their cards were still being used. 2 weeks later, Grace's student ID was found in a rest stop bathroom near Spokane, Washington. A janitor discovered it wedged behind the paper towel dispenser as if it had been deliberately hidden there. The rest stop's security cameras showed dozens of vehicles coming and going around the time the ID must have been left, but none of the images clearly showed the Anderson family. Still, Spokane was 600 miles northwest of the Montana gas station. They were moving, staying ahead of whoever was pursuing them, leaving breadcrumbs that might have been intentional or accidental. Detective Vasquez studied maps late into the night, plotting the locations where evidence had appeared. From Rockford to the Iowa cell tower ping to Montana to Washington, they were heading northwest, possibly toward Canada. But why? Robert had no known connections to the Pacific Northwest, no family or friends who might shelter them there. Unless he'd been planning this for longer than anyone realized, establishing safe houses and resources under identities nobody knew about. In February, the break everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Vincent Calibrazi was arrested in Seattle after a traffic accident. He'd rear-ended another vehicle at a red light, and when police responded, something about his demeanor raised suspicions. A routine ID check revealed multiple warrants, though technically none of them were related to the Anderson case since he hadn't been officially charged. But the FBI was notified immediately, and agents were on a plane to Seattle within hours. The interrogation of Vincent Calibrazi lasted 3 days. He was angry, defensive, and initially refused to cooperate without an attorney. But as the evidence mounted, the surveillance photos, the burner phones, Linda, the private investigator's testimony, his story began to crumble. Finally, exhausted and facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, Calibrazi started talking. What he revealed was both better and worse than anyone had feared. Calibrazi admitted he'd hired Linda to watch the Andersons. He admitted he'd planned to confront Robert, to make him pay for the years stolen from his life, but he insisted he never got the chance. According to Calibrazi, he'd driven to Rockford in late September, planning to approach Robert privately and demand financial compensation, essentially extortion. But when he arrived at the Anderson house that Wednesday night, they were already gone. The TV was on, the door was unlocked, but nobody was home. Calibrazi claimed he'd waited for hours, thinking they'd return. When they didn't, he panicked, realizing that if Robert had somehow known he was coming, the police might already be on their way. He fled Rockford and had been running ever since, convinced he'd be blamed for whatever had happened to the Anderson family. His story seemed too convenient, too self-serving. But lie detector tests were inconclusive, and without physical evidence placing him at the scene beyond his own admission of being there, prosecutors had a weak case for abduction or murder. The revelation that Calibrazi might be telling the truth sent the investigation in a new direction. If he hadn't taken the family, who had? Or had Robert Anderson, aware that Calibrazi was closing in, executed his own disappearance plan? The FBI obtained warrants to search every financial database, looking for hidden accounts or assets Robert might have squirreled away. They found nothing. Robert's finances were exactly as they appeared, middle class, stable, with no hidden wealth that could sustain a family on the run. Then, in early March, a letter arrived at Detective Vasquez's office. It was postmarked from Portland, Oregon, addressed to her personally, with no return address. Inside was a single handwritten page in Diana's distinctive cursive, verified by comparing it to samples from her classroom. The letter was brief. "We're safe. Please stop looking. We can't come back, but we're together and we're okay. Tell my mother I love her and I'm sorry. This was the only way to keep the girls safe." The letter provided few answers and raised countless new questions. Safe from what? If not from Calibrazi, then from whom? Diana's mention of keeping the girls safe suggested a threat against the children specifically, not just against Robert. Detective Vasquez had the letter analyzed by the FBI's Questioned Documents Laboratory. The paper was generic office stock, available at thousands of stores. The ink was from a common ballpoint pen. There were no fingerprints except Diana's, no DNA evidence, nothing that revealed where the letter had actually been written. Elizabeth was allowed to read her daughter's letter under supervision. She wept as she held the paper, touching the words as if she could somehow reach through them to Diana herself. "This doesn't sound like her," Elizabeth said after composing herself. "Diana would never put me through this unless she had absolutely no choice. Something terrified her, something worse than anything we've imagined. My daughter is telling me she's alive, but she's also telling me I'll never see her again." The FBI expanded their investigation into Diana's background, looking for threats that might target her specifically. They uncovered something that had been buried in sealed juvenile records. When Diana was 16, she'd been a witness in a case involving her best friend's father, who had been abusing his daughter. Diana had convinced her friend to come forward, had testified in family court, and her testimony had been instrumental in removing the man's parental rights and sending him to prison for assault. That man, Gregory Vaughan, had been released from prison 3 years earlier after serving a 20-year sentence. Upon his release, he'd immediately tried to contact his daughter, now in her 30s with a family of her own. When she refused to see him, obtaining a restraining order, Vaughan had become obsessed with finding everyone he believed had wronged him. Diana's name was on that list. Court records showed Vaughan had requested Diana's contact information multiple times through various legal pretenses, all of which were denied. Vaughan's parole officer reported that he'd been compliant for the first 2 years, but had become increasingly erratic in the months before the Andersons disappeared. He'd missed several mandatory check-ins, and when finally located, he'd been living in a run-down motel in Champaign, Illinois, less than 3 hours from Rockford. His room, when searched, contained printed photographs of Diana taken from her school's website, maps of Rockford with certain streets circled, and a handwritten list of names that included Diana, Robert, Lily, and Grace. Gregory Vaughan was arrested immediately on parole violations. Unlike Calibrazi, Vaughan didn't bother denying his intentions. In a chilling interview with federal agents, he described how he'd been planning to abduct Grace, the younger daughter, as revenge against Diana for destroying his family. He'd researched her schedule, identified the route she walked home from school, even tested how quickly he could force someone into his vehicle, but he insisted he never got the opportunity. When he drove by the Anderson house that Wednesday evening, it was empty. 2 predators, both with grudges against the Anderson family, both claiming they'd arrived too late. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet the evidence supported both stories. Investigators theorized that Robert and Diana had somehow learned they were being targeted, perhaps through the letter, perhaps through their own research, perhaps through an anonymous warning. Realizing they faced threats from multiple directions, they'd made the agonizing decision to disappear, taking their daughters and vanishing into a life they could never return from. Over the following months, occasional small signs continued to appear. A photo posted on a hiking blog showed 4 figures in the background on a trail in British Columbia. The heights and builds matched the Andersons, but their faces were turned away. A receipt found in a used book sold in Portland bore Diana's fingerprint, though it was weeks old by the time it was discovered. Lily's name appeared on a volunteer sign-up sheet at a food bank in Eugene, Oregon, but the address and phone number given were false. Each piece of evidence suggested the family was alive, but living under assumed identities, moving frequently, staying off the grid as much as possible in a digital age where true anonymity was nearly impossible. They were ghosts in their own lives, watching the world move on without them. Robert couldn't contact his brother, Diana couldn't see her mother, the girls couldn't go to school, couldn't maintain friendships, couldn't live anything resembling normal teenage lives. They'd chosen survival over existence. Detective Vasquez eventually had to accept a reality that went against every instinct she had as a police officer. Sometimes people don't want to be found. Sometimes the system fails to protect them, and they have to protect themselves. She kept the case file open, added every new piece of evidence as it trickled in, but she stopped conducting active searches. The Anderson family had made their choice, and pursuing them harder might expose them to the very dangers they'd fled. Elizabeth moved back to Arizona, but kept her hotel room in Rockford rented for another year, unable to fully let go of the hope that her daughter might return. She gave interviews when asked, always showing Diana's photo, always asking anyone who might have seen her family to respect their privacy, but let them know they were loved. On what would have been Grace's 13th birthday, Elizabeth visited the Anderson house, now occupied by a new family, and left flowers on the doorstep without explanation. James eventually sold the house, unable to bear the emotional weight of maintaining his brother's property. The new owners were a young couple with no children, drawn by the good school district and tree-lined street. They knew about the house's history, but didn't let it deter them. Life continued. The neighborhood moved on. Only those who had known the Andersons personally kept the memory alive, wondering occasionally where they were, hoping they'd found some measure of peace. Both Vincent Calibrazi and Gregory Vaughan were prosecuted for their crimes. Calibrazi received additional prison time for extortion and stalking. Vaughan was sentenced to life imprisonment after investigators discovered evidence linking him to another attempted abduction several years earlier. The men who had terrorized the Anderson family would never threaten anyone again, but the damage was done. A family had been scattered to the winds, forced to abandon everything they'd built, living as strangers in a world where their real names could never be spoken. 3 years after that September night, on a grey afternoon in early spring, a woman who resembled Diana Anderson sat on a bench in a small coastal town in Alaska. She watched 2 teenage girls, one tall and serious-looking, the other smaller and more animated, walk along the water's edge, laughing at something on their phone. A man joined the woman on the bench, handing her a cup of coffee without speaking. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the girls, the ocean, the seabirds wheeling overhead. The woman's hair was shorter now, colored a shade darker. She wore glasses she didn't need, part of a disguise that had become so habitual she barely noticed it anymore. She'd learned to answer to a different name, to recite a fabricated history, to live with the constant low-level anxiety that someone might recognize her. But her daughters were healthy and safe. Her family was together. That was enough. It had to be enough. Back in Rockford, the Anderson case remained technically open, filed among hundreds of other unsolved missing persons investigations that haunted police departments across the country. The television in their old living room had long since been turned off, the house redecorated and filled with new memories. But somewhere in a filing cabinet in the Rockford Police Department, Detective Vasquez kept a folder with the family's photos, the mysterious letter, the surveillance images, all the pieces of a puzzle that would never quite fit together. The story of the Anderson family became a cautionary tale told in law enforcement training seminars, about the limitations of protection, about how fear can drive people to desperate measures, about the unintended consequences of seeking justice. It was discussed in victim advocacy groups, analyzed by criminologists, referenced in articles about witness protection and domestic security. But for those who had known them personally, they weren't a case study or a statistic. They were real people who had made an impossible choice when faced with impossible circumstances. Elizabeth died 5 years after her daughter disappeared, never knowing for certain what had happened to Diana and the girls, never receiving confirmation beyond that single letter. At her funeral, James gave a eulogy that mentioned his brother's family, speaking of them in the present tense, refusing to use past tense verbs that implied death. He believed they were out there somewhere, living under different names, looking different, speaking carefully, always watching over their shoulders. He had to believe it because the alternative was unbearable. Sometimes, late at night, Detective Vasquez would drive past the old Anderson house. She'd park across the street and look at the lit windows, imagining the new family inside going about their evening routines. She'd think about Robert and Diana and Lily and Grace, wherever they were, and she'd whisper a quiet hope that they'd found safety, that the sacrifice had been worth it, that somewhere they were still together. The television in the Anderson living room that had been left on, playing to an empty room, had been the last physical evidence of their former life, a frozen moment of normalcy before everything changed. It had continued broadcasting its programs into the darkness, weather forecasts and news reports and sitcom laugh tracks, as if the family might return at any moment to resume watching. But they never did. The Andersons had walked out of their life and into the unknown, choosing uncertainty over certain danger, exile over extinction. In the end, their story had no neat resolution, no dramatic rescue, no tearful reunion. It had only absence, the empty spaces where they used to be, the unanswered questions, the wondering. For some families who face impossible threats, disappearing is the only solution, even when it means losing everything else. The Andersons had vanished overnight, leaving behind a house, a life, and a mystery that would endure long after the television was finally turned off and the lights went dark.